This video is for reading 12, which is entitled Critical Thinking About Inequality, An Emerging Lens. And the authors are Bonnie Thornton Deal and Ruth Enid Zambrana. The purpose of this video is to highlight some of the key points and observations from the reading, as well as to offer some additional sociological context in regards to some of the ideas and concepts the authors raise, as well as to end with some discussion questions for students to consider on their own. So certainly one of the key points from the reading is right there in the first sentence. Key sociological argument is that inequality and oppression are deeply woven into American life, and that's from page 131. And you can kind of approach this statement by thinking, what is some historical evidence of this, and then some contemporary evidence of this. And so, if you've taken your American history classes, you can probably rattle off some historical, events and policies that illustrate the ways in which racial, ethnic inequality and oppression were a key component of, United States policies and social institutions in regards to pretty much all the racial ethnic minority groups in this country. Contemporary evidence of this usually requires students to be a little bit savvier about, what the research states. But there are sociologists and other academics that are constantly doing, audit studies and other type of, empirical tests to illustrate the ways in which, contemporary prejudice and discrimination still exist and still impact the lives of racial and ethnic minorities, as well as gender and sexual minorities as well. And so part of how, the consequences of this, part of how we discuss and present and talk about them is, by pointing to our data that shows there are these disparities that exist in regards to, income levels, wealth, education, housing in terms of like home ownership, but also housing in terms of, where do people live in racially integrated or racially segregated areas, and then, the overall kind of socioeconomic status of those areas, occupation, political power, and just a range of indicators where we can see that there are clear disparities, based on some of our major social divisions, things like race, gender, nationality, sexuality, and so one thing the authors note is that oftentimes when sociologists, like, as well as other academics, when they oftentimes study this phenomena, they often just focus on one social division, one social characteristic at a time. So they might look at, race related disparities in educational attainment, or they might look at gender related disparities in income, right? When we talk about like the gender pay gap, they might relate to sexuality disparities in political power and political representation. Oftentimes they are focused like solely on one social, social division, one social status. And the authors note that, this is problematic because, of course, this is not how people live and experience their lives. And that some of these intersections in particular, in regards to some of these social statuses. Some of these intersections are, particularly important or significant because they can represent a person having cumulative, compounding, intersecting, um, uh, disadvantages that make them uniquely disadvantaged in the system, or conversely, a person could have intersecting, compounding advantages that make them especially advantaged in the system. And if you're only focused on one specific social status, then you're going to miss the ways in which it isn't just that status, it's the other statuses that is leading them to be particularly, well situated or particularly poorly situated within the larger, society, larger social structure. And so this speaks to, of course, the point of of this reading, which is understanding how taking on the intersectional lens will help us not just understand inequality better, but also help us understand people's actual lived experiences. And this reading also addresses, what do we need to do with this knowledge in order to make society better? Before we jump into some specifics about this article, from this article, let me just provide a little bit of background about intersectionality. So, intersectionality is really building upon this, the concept of social identities, right? That we, or what is sometimes referred to as social statuses, that there are recognizable positions in society, that, people recognize that we have different characteristics, and that oftentimes with these social statuses, these differences can even be placed like in a hierarchy where some statuses or identities are seen as being more desirable, and have a kind of better public perception, have more positive stereotypes associated with them than others. And so, and because these are social identities, that means that these identities are socially constructed and socially situated, which means that the identities available to you, the identities that people associate with you, along with their corresponding stereotypes and perceptions, will vary by society, by time and place. Right. The identities that are important and significant, and the characteristics we associate with those identities, is different in 2021 America than what it necessarily is in like 2021, South Korea, or 2021 Finland, and it's different in 2021 America than it would have been in 1968 America versus 1820 America. So just once again, anytime you see that word social, just remember that the actual kind of content, details, if you will, of these identities, it's not stable, it's not fixed. It has changed, and it probably will continue to change in the future. But kind of based on some of the social identities that are particularly important or salient, for the last few decades, things like race, and class, and ability, sexuality, gender. You can add to, the little image there, things like age, things like religion. All of those are social identities that, to a certain extent, we consider to be important or significant in our country. We have certain associations, based upon, those social identities. And the thing is the concept of intersectionality, is predicated upon the idea you don't just have one social identity at a time, right? You have multiple social identities, and you experience those social identities, and people perceive you and understand you and interact with you not just through the lens of one dominant social identity, but through an intersection of those social identities. They intersect, they overlap, right? And so, yes, I am a woman, but I am a woman of color who is also heterosexual, who, as much as I hate to admit it myself sometimes now, is middle age. I don't have a physical or mental disability. And I am educated and upper middle class by education, if not always by salary. And all of those things matter, right? Some of those things matter more or less in different contexts. But it's hard for me to really talk about my experience as just a woman, because that's not how I experience that identity. I experienced it through its intersection with all of those other identities. And that's really what the concept of intersectionality is all about. And that term was coined by academic Kimberly Crenshaw, to understand, the ways in which at the time she was especially focused on, race and gender, that people could be, it isn't just that they are disadvantaged by race and or disadvantaged by gender, but that people can be doubly disadvantaged based upon their race and gender. Or, like I said, flip of the coin, doubly advantaged. And this goes along with a concept that also comes up quite a bit in sociology, which is the concept of privilege. And when it comes to the concept of privilege, and I know a lot of non-academics, use the term in a variety of ways on social media, but I'm really using the definition by Peggy McIntosh, and she described it in one of her articles that she wrote on the concept as a invisible, knapsack of privileges that people can kind of access when needed. And I really like that definition for a variety of reasons, right? It's this idea of invisibility, that sometimes we don't really notice the ways in which that we're privileged because it feels normative to us. It feels normal, right? We don't necessarily know that we are receiving benefits from other people or from the, society as a whole, because we've always received those benefits and we perceive that as being the norm. I like the idea of it being a knapsack, right? That these privileges exist and we don't always need them. We don't always draw upon them, but we subconsciously can and do, when needed, right? It's available there to us, for us to call upon, in certain situations, even if we aren't even conscious that we're calling upon it. And so when you take both of these concepts together, the concept of intersectionality and this academic concept of privilege, these concepts kind of combine, help us understand our personal matrix of domination, which is a concept that was created by another female academic, Patricia Hill Collins. Um, and the matrix of domination, really just emphasizes that, we experience our overlapping, our intersecting, identities through this matrix of, for some identities we're advantaged, for in some identities, we're disadvantaged. This doesn't necessarily mean that, our advantage identities offset or cancel out, our disadvantaged identities. It just means that how we experience those advantages or disadvantages are complex, right? So, instead of it kind of being kind of this like flat, just kind of, like two-dimensional image, like what you kind of see in front of you, when you're actually experiencing it, it's multi-dimensional, right? It isn't like, oh, because I am advantaged in terms of my social class, but I'm disadvantaged, in a lot of situations because of my race. this is definitely going to, play out this way. It's never that straightforward. It is complicated and it is complex. And I think this article, although it can be a little, dense to read and understand, I really think that's at the heart of the article, is really trying to emphasize the kind of complexity of our identities, and that because our identities are complex, this leads to the ways in which that we are treated in society by other people, by larger institutions, is also complex and complicated. And it goes back to the author's point, it does a disservice to the study of inequalities if you really just kind of address them, one social status, at a time. And so they identify at the beginning of the reading, what are some of the goals of intersectionality. And they indicate, using intersectionality to reformulate the world of ideas so that it really incorporates, the contradictory and overlapping ways that human life is experienced. Um, uh, because people rarely experience their life through the lens of only one identity. It's almost always, the full complexity of who they are as individuals within society. Um, Conveying this more complex knowledge by rethinking curricula and promoting institutional change in higher education institutions, right? And not only have we not really talked about people who are, who fall outside of the dominant group, whether it's, people who are working class or poor, or whether it's, racial ethnic minorities, whether it's, sexual minorities, gender minorities, whether it's people that have disabilities. We don't often center or talk about their experiences uh, in higher ed. Or what might be even worse is when we do talk about it, we talk about it, in standalone courses, or, where it's like, oh, this course is on, the Asian American Pacific Islander experience, as opposed to just incorporating that experience into a regular history class, right? Or you take a course and you're like, oh, we're going to be reading the writers who identify themselves as being queer, as opposed to just incorporating those writers in kind of a basic standard, English class. So, they're hoping that intersectionality will become more interwoven in how we structure our higher ed courses, and our higher education institutions. Um, they want to, or they see that, a possible goal would be to apply the knowledge in an effort to create a society in which all voices are heard, right? Understanding, like I said, that some people are doubly disadvantaged, triply disadvantaged, and some people are triply, quadruply advantaged. And too many times, historically in our society, people who have a lot of advantages have kind of been placed in the center, in the forefront. They have the loudest voices, and their stories have been the ones most, heard and recognized. And so intersectionality is looking to push back against that tendency. And then finally, the final goal the authors address in regards to intersectionality is, using the intersectional lens to advocate for public policies that are responsive to multiple voices. Because so often, if a policy is created to address, one specific social identity, but doesn't necessarily look at the ways in which people's lived experiences can be very diverse because of other intersecting identities, this is how you wind up with public policies that are not necessarily beneficial or helpful to some of the most vulnerable people in society. So they provide us a little bit of background about intersectionality, making it clear some things that they think is important for readers to know in regards to its history, as well as, how they think it operates, like on a academic and theoretical level, as well as just like a everyday kind of lived experience level. And so they note that, the concept of intersectionality comes primarily from women of color scholars who worked in the fields of ethnic and women's studies. Literally, all three of those names that I just discussed: Kimberly Crenshaw, Peggy McIntosh, Patricia Hill Collins. All of them are women. Crenshaw and Collins are African American women, and although some of them are also sociologists, they are sociologists that have focused primarily on issues dealing with race or gender. And part of the reason why it's been women of color scholars who are located in the fields of ethnic and women's studies is because it's that idea of understanding that you aren't just being defined by your race, and you're not just being defined by your gender, but that it is a unique intersection. And within those specific fields of ethnic and women's studies, of course, those fields were largely created in the 70s as a way of addressing the fact that the experience and the text and the work of people of color, as well as women, had been largely overlooked in academia. They weren't a part of the core curricula, and so these departments originally came about to address that lack and that invisibility, because at the time that was seen as being a more beneficial, a more helpful way to address that lack, as opposed to just integrating those voices, those experiences, those texts in the regular curricula, the regular courses. Now, they emphasize that even though they are talking a lot about academia, and they use the word theoretical perspective and theoretical interventions, which of course sound very academic, but they also really want to point out that intersectionality as a lens is useful in just everyday people, helping them understand and express their real lived experiences, right? So if you've ever experienced anything and you're like, okay, I don't think this happened to me just because I am a fill in the blank, because I'm also a fill in a blank, right? And you weren't sure exactly how to make sense of it or understand it. This really just kind of underscores the hope around intersectionality, that people will stop thinking about themselves and thinking of others through this single lens focus, and really try to consider the fact that that they and others have these multiple social identities, which means people's identities and people's experiences are much more complicated than we always give than what we always give credit for. I've already kind of addressed the fact that marginalized groups haven't, necessarily been considered as being, worthy of study, and that their experiences and their texts that they have produced haven't necessarily been considered knowledge within, the education and the larger kind of societal, sphere. And so that was another kind of point of the early intersectional academics, was to kind of push back against that. And so then they kind of switch, after kind of giving us this discussion of the origins. They then kind of switch to providing a very lengthy definition of what they mean when they say intersectionality should be used as an analytical strategy, and it's on page 133. And even though it's lengthy, I'm going to go ahead and read it out loud, just because there's a lot to unpack there. So halfway down that page, on the right side column, it says, throughout this reading, we treat intersectionality as an analytical strategy, a systematic approach to understanding human life and behavior that is rooted in the experiences and struggles of marginalized people. The premises and assumptions that underlie this approach are: inequalities derived from race, ethnicity, class, gender, and their intersections place specific groups of the population in a privileged position with respect to other groups, and offer individuals unearned benefits based solely on group membership. Historical and systematic patterns of disinvestment in non-privileged groups are major contributors to the low social and economic position of those groups. Representations of groups and individuals in media, art, music, and other cultural forms create and sustain ideologies of group and individual inferiority, superiority, and support the use of these factors to explain both individual and group behavior. And individual identity exists within and draws from a web of socially defined statuses, some of which may be more salient than others in specific situations or at specific historical moments. So, woo, that is a mouthful. But it really highlights some of the points that I've already made, right? The idea that society defines, a range of statuses and uses us, socializes us to identify um, within those statuses. And it's not just how we see and understand ourselves, it's how we see and understand individuals as people, but also individuals as representatives of larger groups. And this, of course, can lead to, prejudices and stereotypes. It can lead us to treat some people more or less well in certain settings, to have, better or worse expectations for our interactions based on the social identities or the intersection of identities that they might have. And that, of course, all of this, can change, across settings and over time. That definition also kind of emphasizes the fact that intersectionality kind of operates on or two levels, the individual level and the societal structural level, right? So on the individual level, of course, it influences how you think about yourself, as well as how you think about and interact with others, and how others think about themselves and interact with you. But then it also exists on this larger societal structural level, where, policies and, systems of power are differentially, given or denied to people on the basis of these statuses. That people have different roles and, and benefit from, like, these group level, or don't benefit from these group level stereotypes and prejudices. And so that exists, outside of the individual, and exist on this larger social level. And so, kind of their final point, just broadly about what the intersectional lens offers, is that, it provides a new way of studying power and inequality, as opposed to focusing, like, on one social identity at a time. It challenges that conventional understanding of oppressed and excluded groups and individuals, by really having us look at the ways in which structures of inequality are interconnected, how some people become more and more powerful because they occupy multiple privileged positions within a society, and some people become less and less powerful and more disenfranchised because they occupy multiple subordinate positions in society. And this gives us a more complete, more comprehensive understanding about the ways in which power, operates, and the consequences of power relations in society, as opposed to just looking at one social identity at a time. And so, a big part of this reading is about what they call theoretical interventions, right? Which is just another way of basically saying, these are, the primary theoretical components of intersectionality. So, if intersectionality is a theory, is a theoretical perspective, it is a way of looking at the world. What are kind of the four primary tenets? The first tenet, which I've kind of already discussed, is it centers the experience of people of color. And I highlight a quote from page 135, just making it clear that intersectional knowledge is distinctive knowledge generated by experiences of previous excluded communities and multiply oppressed groups, right? If what we think we know about society, and what we think we know about history, has really only been through the lens of a specific group or a limited group of people, then we don't really have fully fleshed out knowledge. And, I know that for some people, this is scary and they push back and they say they're rewriting history. But no, we are expanding history to take into account the experiences and the perspectives of people who did not have a lot of power and who therefore their voices were not heard, in our kind of original our original understandings and conceptions of society and history. Kind of the second theoretical intervention, complicating identity. And you've heard me use the word complicate and contradict and comprehensive, so many c words in this video. But once again, just this idea that learning to not see ourselves through one lens at a time, but understanding that we have multiple statuses. Some statuses are more valued than others, and that can vary by setting. For our own individual lives, we might even value or view a particular status or statuses as being more important, as being more dominant, as being more influential than others. And not that that is not necessarily true, but I encourage all of us, if that is you, if you tend to think about yourself through your race or through your class or through your sexuality, also look at those other identities that you're just glossing over. How do they intersect with your dominant identity? Why are you perhaps less comfortable or less willing to consider the ways in which those other identities might be impacting and shaping your experience? Um, it also complicates identity politics by acknowledging the fact that intragroup differences do exist. And sometimes those intragroup differences are very huge, based upon those other meaningful social statuses, right? So, can you really speak of, one group as this unified group? Like, can you really talk about, working class identity? That was something that came up quite a bit in the 2020, elections. What does it mean to be working class? Well, it's probably going to mean something different based on gender. It's going to mean something different based on race. It's going to mean something different based on race and gender. So once again, it is not as straightforward as we may make it seem when we're only talking about one identity at a time. The third theoretical intervention is it unveils power in interconnected structures of inequality. So this section is a little bit more theoretically dense, meaning a lot more academic in tone than the previous two sections. And it begins with a quote from Patricia Hill Collins, her book, Black Feminist Thought. And she is trying to describe how we should start thinking about power using what she calls a both and definition. It's both a force that some groups use to oppress others and an intangible entity that operates throughout a society and is organized in particular domains. And so I think it's important because, right, groups can have power. They can have power, interpersonal power. They can use their interpersonal power and their power they might have in certain settings to oppress others. But then power also just exists in society. Like, it doesn't belong to one specific group, that there is, to use her words, it's an intangible entity. It's been already kind of structured throughout society in our policies and our laws and our institutions. And at this point, it's just kind of been embedded in some of the workings and underpinnings of society. So it's not necessarily one specific group of people actively trying to oppress another group of people at this given point in time. It's more like, if we don't do anything to change the policies and the structures and the laws that were maybe created 50, 100, 200 years ago, the end result is some people are more likely to be oppressed and negatively impacted by just kind of the daily, the daily systematic runnings of the system. And um, there is a discussion of, what she means by this in regards to, the interrelated domains, and how these interrelated domains, all have power associated with them. And your book goes into more detail, but, the four domains are structural, disciplinary, hegemonic, and interpersonal. And so, the one that I think a lot of people think of when they talk about like power relations and power dynamics is they go to the interpersonal, because that's the one that that's the one that feels more tangible. That's the one that we have more experience with. You think about the ways in which, your boss has power over you, or, if, in an argument, or when you and a coworker are maybe presenting different, competing visions, or, competing ideas, perhaps that coworker will have more power than you because they are part of a dominant group. Maybe they're, a man, or maybe they're straight, or maybe they're white. Maybe, they don't have a disability, right? And so in that moment, they have more interpersonal power that they can call upon. So I think that's the one that we're oftentimes more familiar with, but the other three do exist. Hegemonic refers to cultural ideologies and images and representations that shape group and individual consciousness, right? So these are the images and representations of those social statuses and those social identities that are perpetuated in larger society through the media, through the educational system, through the history books. This is how some groups have more or less positive stereotypes associated with them, based upon how they are presented and represented, through these ideological agents. And then this impacts how people perceive them, how they perceive them as individuals, how they perceive their groups. And so, that's a domain. The structural domain, speaks to, of course, the ways in which our social institutions have been set up, in regards to both past and present policies, that can lead to some people being, more or less privileged, in these different institutions. The example that I provide oftentimes in class is like, okay, our judicial system. The fact that we say everyone has a right to representation, and if you can't afford, a public defender is provided for you. But a public defender, because they are oftentimes, underpaid, overworked, they don't have the ability to dedicate the time and resources to their individual clients the way if you have, the ability to hire a private attorney. And so we can literally look at, the conviction rates of private attorneys versus public defenders, and you can see a disparity. And then it's like, okay, well, who's most likely to use a public defender? Well, oftentimes people who have, who have less money. And so therefore, who is most likely to wind up in prison, especially if it's for a fairly low level infraction? Well, it's going to be people that are lower in social class. And so this is what's meant by, structural power. It's not that the rich are in that moment actively oppressing the poor, but how we have structurally set up a very important social institution in our society, the criminal justice system, results in lower class people, being more likely to be negatively impacted by just, the day-to-day operations of the court system. And then the one that I think is probably the hardest to understand, just because it's so close to structural power, and the structural domain, is the disciplinary domain, which your book defines as the ideas and practices that characterize and sustain bureaucratic hierarchies. And so it's the idea that a lot of our social institutions and structures operate as bureaucracies, which mean you have individual people holding these positions, and they have they have power within their given roles, and they're supposed to be enacting their roles and carrying out their duties in this objective, dispassionate way, but they're just people. And when you consider, the impact of, hegemonic power and interpersonal power, what happens is their own biases, their own stereotypes, their own prejudices can come into play. And so in this way, it's not just that our social institutions structurally disempower some groups of people, but that our social institutions are also staffed and managed by human beings that then, yield disciplinary power that does not uniformly treat everyone in the same way. And so, I know this reading was a little jargony and a little bit more dense, but hopefully this video helped to break some of those concepts and ideas down, because I do think it's really important and significant to, the points and arguments that the authors are making. The questions that I encourage you to consider based on this reading: using the concept of matrix of domination, in what ways are you a member of both systematically privileged as well as systematically oppressed groups? How has this impacted your life? When thinking about your life experiences, do you think it is easier to recognize your privileges or your disadvantages? And are you more or less comfortable discussing one as opposed to the other, right? So are you maybe more comfortable talking about the way you're privileged, or are you more comfortable talking about the way you're disadvantaged? Or who knows, maybe you're just not comfortable talking about this topic at all, which I guess you're in luck that we are online and not face to face. Second question I would like for you to consider: the authors end with the claim that the intersectional lens is transformative. How might using the intersectional lens impact people on the individual level, the interpersonal level, and the institutional/societal level? Do you think people would be supportive or not of these transformations? How might the concept of power impact people's responsiveness to these potentials and transformations? And that just kind of reminds me that I actually skipped the fourth theoretical intervention, which is intersectionality. The hope is it will promote social justice and social change. And they provide you a quote from the NGO forum of the UN Conference on Racism in 2001 from page 139. And it's really just, if you look at the end of that quote, it says, an intersectional approach highlights the way in which there is a simultaneous interaction of discrimination as a result of multiple identities, right? And it's this idea that, if you look at, beginning really in America, at least in the 1960s, we started to have this real political kind of pushback to at least de jure discrimination on the basis of race and gender. We started to, both through people engaging in social movements like the civil rights movement, like the women's movement, as well as, politicians passing, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and a variety of other, Equal Employment Act, all types of policies that were meant to address the discrimination and oppression of minority groups. But this, the point that the quote from the NGO forum is making, is that so many of these policies have been focused solely on, one status, one social identity at a time, and they are pushing countries and lawmakers to consider the fact that people need protection from the intersecting ways in which they can be disenfranchised on the basis of multiple social identities. And if we were to start looking at our policies and passing policies with that in mind, the authors indicate that this could be transformative. And that is why I was asking that question about, if we were to engage in these transformative policies, how would it change society? And do you think people would be supportive? And particularly, people who are benefiting from society the way it is, especially people who are benefiting across multiple social identities, would they be responsive to this transformation? How could we convince them that to be, to view this potential transformation in a positive light? So, just interesting questions for you to consider.